Well, I'm glad you could join us again for our second part on the wilderness. We want to look at a story today that talks about the wilderness. And as you try and look into the Bible and look at what the Bible says, it's almost as if the wilderness is a character in the story. Uh, it doesn't have personality, and yet it seems to take on personality. It doesn't have an actual voice, and yet sometimes it has a voice. It doesn't have a lot of things, and yet it is a force that is in the world that you can see people trying to deal with. And so today we wanted to take a look at the story of Moses and what happens with Moses. Moses was born in a very difficult time. He's not born in the wilderness, he's born in the big city. He's born in Egypt. He is born where the palace is, there's the capital, there's all kinds of buildings around, and yet he's born in a time when it was especially difficult for them because Israel had eventually become captives and they were doing their own work. They were the ones who were building all the things around, and Pharaoh was just taking advantage of that fact that they were able to build all the things around and forcing them to work. No wages, of course. And then on top of that, he was afraid the nation would be strong. And so he decided the best thing to do would be to destroy all the male babies. And so as Moses is born, we see this tremendous faith in his mother, who decides not to destroy all the male babies. She's certainly not going to destroy her son, but she does something rather extreme. It is a measure of faith, and it's probably where Moses learns all of this as he understands his own story. She decides to build a basket, cover it so that it is waterproof, put Moses in the basket, and set the basket loose in the Nile River. Well, not down the rapids or anything like that, but probably where the queen would be coming to bathe, and then puts the sister there to watch over the basket, make sure it doesn't tip over or anything like that, and also so that they would know what was going on. And you know the story about Moses. It's one of those classic stories where the queen comes and she is there to bathe and she hears Moses and sees the basket, and then she decides that this is the most beautiful child she's ever seen, and she takes Moses back to the palace to be with her, and she is going to raise him as her own. Well, the sister is there to suggest perhaps they need someone to take care of the babysitter, the nurse. And so she goes and gets Moses' mother. And so for a long time, Moses is able to have his own mother there as he learns about what Egypt is, and he grows up in the palace. He is not under any threat, he is not under any danger. The queen would absolutely protect him. He doesn't need to go outside. He's not going to catch a virus if he had to. Uh, he is completely safe and protected in his own environment. And when you think about that and where this story goes, what we see is Moses completely protected in his own environment with all the things around him. And yet he does grow up and realizes who he is. He's not Egyptian. That's never been hidden. Everyone knows he's not Egyptian. He's an Israelite. It's not hidden from Moses. It's not hidden from the other people. And so Moses kind of knows his identity, but can choose what his identity will be. And so once he is grown, he goes out to find out what's the condition of his people. What's going on in the outside world? He does not have to. He could have just stayed in the palace and everything would have been great for him. Why would he do that? Why would he go out and check on his people? But he feels a very intense need to do that. And so he ventures out of the palace and he goes to find out about his people. Exodus 2:11. One day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people, and he looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. And he looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian, and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, behold, two Hebrews were struggling together. And he said to the man in the wrong, Why do you strike your companion? And he answered, Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? When Moses was afraid, and he thought that surely the thing is known. And when Pharaoh heard it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. As Moses goes out to check on his people to see what's going on with them, he wants to understand what's happening with them. He very much is in tune with the Word of God, and he very much believes in the Word of God, and he believes that God is God over Israel because he has great faith. His mother has taught him this, and yet he doesn't quite know what the conditions are like outside. He's been trained as one of the leaders of Egypt. And so he has all of this skill, and you can just see the impatience and how young he is with what he's trying to accomplish. He thinks he can go out and he thinks he can accomplish all of this because he is a young man and he has great strength. And he goes out and he finds what he didn't want to find. He finds an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. He finds cruelty, and it's cruelty against his own people. And he very much feels this idea of my people and those people, even though he's grown up in the palace, and all the people he knows are Egyptian. Maybe some servants were Hebrew, but that's all he knows. But he knows about cruelty, and so he decides this is not right, and he goes to intervene with the man who is beating this Hebrew slave, and he does the unthinkable. Rather than trying to resolve the process or talk him down, he responds with his own kind of violence. In fact, his own kind of violence is even more. And he kills the Egyptian, buries him in the sand, thinks he's gotten away with it because the text says he looked around. You know how that is. Is anybody coming? We're going to see if anybody's going to catch me in this. And so he looks around to see what's there, and nobody's there. Nobody's even seen this. Nobody's going to know. And he thinks he's gotten away with it because, after all, who's going to tell? Well, the next day he comes out and he finds two Israelites arguing. He tries to stop them. And so he goes over to them and he attempts to intervene. And one of them says to him, Are you going to do the same thing to us, your same kind of justice? Are you going to kill me like you did the Egyptian? Well, Moses all of a sudden panics. Now he knows that it's been revealed and that everyone's going to know about this. They know about his sin. They know about where he is, and they know that Moses is not the kind of leader. And he feels this failure because the guy responds to him, Who made you the prince over us? Well, God did, right? I mean, look at history. Look at what's happened to us. I'm here as the leader. There's no other leaders around. There's no one else being trained. And so Moses really is the leader. He's the only choice. And yet this guy somehow doesn't get it. He doesn't understand that. He doesn't see him as being the deliverer that God is going to bring to save his people. Not at all. In fact, he just sees Moses as somebody who's getting in the way. That's got to be discouraging because this is the failure of his whole life. Everything that he thought he was trained to be, everything he thought he was trained to do, is suddenly gone. He can't lead these people. He can't even solve an argument between two of them. How is he ever going to lead them as his people? How are they ever going to listen to him? What's ever going to make that kind of difference in them? How is it ever going to be that Moses can solve the situation, the cruelty that is going on with his own people? And he decides enough is enough. He knows what's going to happen when Pharaoh hears of it, that he's going to try and kill him. And sure enough, when Pharaoh hears of it, Pharaoh does try to kill him, but by then Moses is long gone. And Moses flees from there to the land of Midian. And in the land of Midian, he goes to the priest of Midian. And the priest of Midian happens to have 7 daughters. And the priest of Midian takes in Moses, essentially, gives him one of his daughters named Zipporah. Moses is going to have a couple of kids with her. Gershom is one of those kids. And then you're going to see how he basically gives up on that dream and decides, at least I am safe from Egypt. And where does he end up that is his safe place from Egypt? Well, he's in the wilderness. That's his safe place. When you run away from Egypt and you run away from the dangers that you've seen there, you run away from the city and you go to where you can be alone. You go to the wilderness. It's a complete different place.
Exodus chapter 3. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian. And he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness, and he came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of the bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. And when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. And then he said, Do not come near. Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place in which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, and he was afraid to look at God.
And so Moses leads his sheep to the west side of Horeb. He leads them to a place that's called the Mountain of God. The Mountain of God? How would he know it's the Mountain of God? Well, there's probably a couple of reasons. It might come from Abraham, who might know on his journey where the Mountain of God was. But that's kind of a long shot. It probably comes from Jethro. He's the priest of Midian. And we may want to discount Jethro as being, a priest that nobody cares about, but he might actually be a priest of God. And so, as Jethro is a priest, he would know where the mountain of God is. And Moses is leading his sheep all the way around this mountain of God. He leads them to the other side of the mountain of God. And there he sees something he hadn't expected to see. An angel comes and appears to him in a bush, and there's fire, and the bush isn't burned up. And it was so strange, such an unusual sight, that he didn't know what to do with that. I mean, maybe there had been fires there before and he could understand that, but now this time, this is a whole different situation. And so, what if this bush burst into flame? I know it's cactus, but I mean, what if it burst into flame all of a sudden, but it wasn't burned up, it was just burning? Well, first of all, we'd have to call the fire department because the fire risk is high. Or, maybe this bush, pick a bush, whichever one, and it burns, but it doesn't burn up. And all that was is to get Moses' attention. And he goes over to where the bush is. And God speaks to him out of the bush. And the first thing he says is, Moses, you need to respect me. He says, the place where you're standing is holy ground. Take off your sandals. And so Moses goes to take off his sandals. And it's the one time where we have this concept of being in the presence of God, and the ground where he is standing is God's ground. It's so holy that there should not be shoes worn there. And so he takes off his sandals out of reverence for God, to realize that, God is great, God is all powerful. And as he stands there and thinks about what's going on, God is going to speak to him out of the bush. And God has a plan for him. God has something he wants him to do. And so God tells him, I'm the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. He's the God of his forefathers, the God that he is going to worship, the God that he serves. It's interesting to note that God meets Moses in the wilderness. Although the plan looked perfect in Egypt, God did not ever appear to Moses in Egypt. It appears as if the mountain of God is also not near the city. It's not near a crossroads. It's not near a place where people would normally come. The mountain of God is in the wilderness. It's in a place that's alone. It's in a place where there isn't other people around. And the place where Moses stands is holy ground. And God demands respect for that. If you come in my presence, you recognize me. And certainly we see Moses doing that as he's about to listen to God and what God has in store for him.
Exodus 3, verse 7. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and I have heard their cry because of their taskmasters, and I know their suffering. And I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of the land to a good and broad land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanite and the Hittite and the Amorite and the Perizzite and Hivite and the Jebusites. And now, behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me. And I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? And he said, But I will be with you, and this shall be a sign for you, that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain.
And so God says, I have heard the cry of my people. I have heard their anguish, and I've heard their distress, and I have come to deliver them out of the hand of Pharaoh. Well, what an incredible thing after this long of a time. After all, it's been 400 years since they started into this captivity kind of situation. They weren't conquered except by themselves and their lack of awareness of where they were. And so, as God attempts to deliver them, now Egypt is a very strong nation, a very powerful nation, and one that truly is one of the hardest things to ever do. Because now they have grown from 70 people to 1.5 million, 2 million, something like that. How do you move that many people? Just think trying to move your own house.
Well,
It's
one
one of
of
the
the
most
things that
difficult.
we can learn from all of this is that sometimes there's a very big learning curve, and that when you take an iPhone out in the heat of the day, it will tend to seize up. And so there might have to be other arrangements made. And so we're going to finish the story about Moses and some of the things that he said and how God deals with him. God had come to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and bring them to a good and broad land, to a land flowing with milk and honey. He's heard the cry of the people. It's come up to him. He's seen their oppression. And he says to Moses, I'll send you back to Pharaoh, and I want you to bring my people out of Egypt. And so God is placing great trust in Moses to fulfill his task. And Moses he was ready early. He was ready at 40. He knew he had been trained. He could see the progression. He knew all the things that God was planning, and yet it wasn't God's timing. And so it wasn't the right time for God to allow Moses to lead the people out. And now Moses has spent so much time in the wilderness and so much time away that he looks at himself and he isn't ready. It's been 40 years since he was back in Egypt. He doesn't know what Egypt is like. And so as he thinks about this and he realizes where he is, he's 80 years old now. And I think any of us wouldn't have the same dream that we had when we were 40. What an amazing thing that would be to still have the same dream at 80. That would be incredible. But God wants Moses to go back and to bring Israel out. And Moses' first question is, well, who am I that I should bring Israel out of Egypt? And God says to Moses, I will be with you. After all, what else would Moses need if God is with them? And so his answer to that is that, well, I'll be there, so what else is the problem? He tells Moses that you'll know that it's going to be true when you come back here, because I want you to come back here and you're going to worship me on this mountain. And so he gives Moses a sense of direction. He knows exactly where he's going to be and where he's going to be coming. Well, Moses' first objection or excuse is, well, who am I that I could possibly do this? And his second one, after God says, I will be with you, is, well, then who are you? And who do I say that you are when they ask me? And God said, well, I am. I'm eternal. I've always been. And so it's a little bit difficult to explain for Moses. And so God's like, I am who I am. I am eternity. I am God. I am sitting here with you. And so that might be a little bit more difficult to explain. Well, okay, who is God? Well, he said he is. And so Moses' third objection is, well, what if they don't believe me? And so he gives them some miracles that he's able to perform. He gives them the idea that he can turn water into blood. And as he pours out water, it becomes blood. He's going to later use this with the Nile River. He is able then to take his hand and put it inside of his cloak. And when he brings it out, it is full of disease. It is full of leprosy. That was one of the most dangerous things back then. It did not have a cure. And so it was one of the most difficult things to be able to deal with. He puts his hand back inside of his coat and brings it out, and it's completely clean. Well, that's an incredible thing. He tells Moses, I want you to take your staff and throw it on the ground, and when he does, it becomes a snake. And so that's a pretty amazing miracle, and then he tells him to pick it up, and that's maybe the dangerous part of the miracle, but I want you to pick up the snake. And so he picks it up by the tail, and sure enough, it turns back into his staff again. I wonder how he felt about that staff after that, if he kind of left the staff outside the tent or something. And then Moses says, well, but I just don't speak well. I get nervous in front of people, might have been his objection. I don't speak well. That maybe he had a speech impediment or something like that, and so he didn't feel like he was able to speak in front of people. That's often a dangerous or difficult thing for people to do. And God says, well, I'll send Aaron, your brother, with you. Aaron's able to speak, and if you need something, Aaron will speak for you. Well, that isn't working. And so Moses finally, as he's run out of excuses, just finally says, well, why don't you just send somebody else? And basically he's saying, I don't want to go. And at that point, God gets angry. And he's so upset with Moses. And he's so frustrated with Moses. And Moses knows better than to be on the angry side of God. And so Moses decides, all right, I'm going to go. And he leaves to be able to go catch Aaron and for them to go back to Egypt and to lead the people out. But it is this encounter with God in the place of God, in the wilderness, where he meets God, that finally allows him to be able to understand what God wants and for God to call him. The call of God is on God's terms. It's in God's house. It's in God's place. It isn't always where we are. Sometimes we see Jesus calling disciples where they are. But this is a time where Moses goes to meet God in the wilderness. He has gone there because of the danger, and now he finds something much greater there. And so, what are some of the lessons that we can learn from this? Well, first of all, the wilderness is a place where Moses feels safe from Pharaoh. He's been running away. The wilderness may be the place where we are able to run away, and no one else is going to go there. No one else is going to come looking for us there, because after all, it's a desolate place. It's not a place where most people would gather. And so Moses is able to feel completely safe. It's where you run to get away from everything else. And so while he's safe, the wilderness is also a place where he meets God. It's God's mountain that's there. And it's usually in a lone place or in a lone time. Holy ground is there. And it shows a perspective of who God is and the place where God is. It's like being in God's house. That's like God saying, I want you to trust me and learn how to adapt and learn how to adjust. And so as he goes to the wilderness, it's a place where he meets God. If you could find a place where God lived, would you go there? Would you go to that place, even if it was a little bit difficult to live there? It's one of those things that we have to ask ourselves. Oddly enough, the wilderness is where Israel feels completely unsafe. They never do adapt to the wilderness. They don't feel safe there at all. They would rather be slaves in Egypt. And sometimes they're going to say that as they get frustrated about food or water or something like that. Why did you bring us out here to die in this wilderness? Wouldn't it be better if we were slaves in Egypt? I don't think they even understand what they're saying. How is that possible? How would they ever want to be slaves in Egypt? How would they ever choose the beatings of the Egyptians? How would they ever choose to have no wages? How would they choose to have their children killed? And it's just an amazing thing that they would say, well, we should go back to Egypt. And they never do learn to adapt to the wilderness. There's a constant complaint about the wilderness. They're always accusing Moses of trying to kill them there. And so they never were able to really meet God there. Even though Moses took them there, took them to the mountain, they sit there in front of the mountain, and when God speaks from the top of the mountain, the one thing they can say is, please don't let him talk anymore. And they just can't listen to God. And so, sure enough, Moses goes up on the mountain and gets the commandments of God. The other thing is that God provides in the wilderness. There's water that comes from a rock. And all they have to do is ask. And of course, they wait till it's a very desperate time and they've been without water and now they're once again complaining. And you do need water. It's one of those very, very important things. And so you do have to have water. But Moses is able to bring water out of a rock for them. They don't have food. And so God gives manna from heaven and he gives quail. They still have to gather it. But Israel basically doesn't believe in God and doesn't trust God. They see the wilderness as an enemy. They see it as someone who's out to get them, and they never feel safe there. They never feel comfortable there. Even though God has destroyed the Egyptian army behind them, as they go into the wilderness, they feel less and less safe. It's just one of those things that they have never developed faith where God is. Moses needs to be comfortable enough in the wilderness to be able to lead people through. He needs to be able to understand the wilderness, be able to know what it's like, so that he can lead God's people through. He knows about Pharaoh's palace, and after 40 years there, he knows about the wilderness. And God uses both. God uses those two things. And so Moses is using the time that he had there with God to be able to learn what it means to lead God's people. It's one of the most important times that we see the wilderness as it becomes a place that's safe for Moses, a place where he's able to bring people out to meet God. We know that some people just refuse to adapt. They like the way things are. They don't want to change. They want everything to stay exactly the same, and they're not willing to consider other things. They insist that everything stays exactly the same. And actually, that never happens. And so they may find themselves in a world that has changed all around them, and yet they are unable to cope in that world because they refuse. They think it can't change. And yet we see God doing that. We see God changing the world around them and saying to the Israelites, you're not going to stay in Egypt. You are going to come out. And this had been God's plan all along, is to bring his nation, his people, the children of Israel out of Egypt, to give them this new land, to give them this new Messiah, to make them to be able to be his people. But that first means going through a wilderness and learning to adapt. And so it seems like we need to learn to adapt too. Things are a little different right now, and they might be different in the future. It's a little bit different when we meet people. We don't shake hands or hug near as much as what we did at one time. And we may learn to do that and go back to that again, but it might take a while. And we'll have a harder time doing that. Our wilderness might be in some of the things around us now that we're limited in being able to do. Our wilderness might be that we're going to have to venture out and be able to do some of these things and go to a place where we can meet God. But whichever one it is, we see in both of these that we're able to meet God on his terms. Moses was alone in the desert, and he ran there because of something he did, because his dream had died. And yet he meets God, and God has a much bigger dream for him. In the wilderness is where you have to deal with excuses. You can't just have excuses for everything. But when you meet God there, you're going to have to deal with the excuses. You're going to have to adapt. And so we look at this wilderness and this situation as God is leading his people to the promised land, to a land that he wants to give them, to a land that is so much better. And yet, why is it so much of a struggle? If we think about that today, is God leading us to someplace better, to someplace that's absolutely great and wonderful? And yet, are we refusing to go because it's so different? I think sometimes people refuse Christianity just because they can't wrap their head around it. They can't quite understand it. It's not familiar. And you do have to learn some new things. You do have to learn how to worship. And there is a learning curve in learning to study the Bible and learning to be close to God and learning to pray. And what does it mean to be spiritual? And how can we be holy? And so all of these things and these relationships we have with people, how can we have holy relationships and be a people that are righteous? Well, a lot of that might be what we learn in the wilderness, where we're able to go and meet God. And he is the one who leads us through. He is the one who is there with us. And all you have to do is just go on the journey with him.